Alina felt the whole church go silent before she understood why. She stood at the altar in her white gown, her hands trembling around a bouquet of white roses, and watched her groom, Julian Cross, walk straight past her. He did not stop. He did not look back. He walked to the second row of the church and took the hand of her own sister, Camille. For a moment, Alina thought her mind was playing a cruel trick on her. She blinked, expecting Julian to turn around and laugh, to say it was some strange joke meant to test her patience. But Julian did not turn around. He lifted Camille's hand to his lips and kissed it gently, right there in front of 200 guests who had come to celebrate a wedding that no longer existed. Whispers spread through the pews like a fire catching dry grass. Alina's mother covered her mouth. Her father looked down at his shoes, unwilling to meet his daughter's eyes. Nobody stood up. Nobody said a word in her defense. It was as if the entire room had already agreed to this outcome long before she walked down the aisle. Alina looked at Camille, searching her sister's face for even a flicker of shame. She found none. Camille only smiled, calm and composed, as though she had been waiting years for this exact moment to arrive. The priest cleared his throat, unsure of what to do with a wedding that had 2 brides and 1 groom pointing in the wrong direction. Alina did not wait for him to decide. She reached up and unpinned her veil with steady fingers, though her heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears. She folded the veil once, carefully, the way her grandmother had taught her to fold linen, and placed it on the altar rail. Then she turned and walked down the aisle alone, her white gown dragging softly against the stone floor, past every guest who refused to look directly at her. She heard someone gasp. She heard her own name whispered like a warning. She did not stop walking. Outside, the sky had turned gray, heavy with the promise of rain. Alina stood on the church steps and breathed in the cold air, trying to steady herself. Carriages waited in a neat row along the street, ribbons still tied to their doors in celebration of a wedding that had just collapsed in front of everyone she knew. She thought of the months of preparation, the fittings, the letters, the quiet nights she had spent imagining a life with Julian. None of it had been real. It had all been a performance leading toward this single, humiliating moment. A light rain began to fall, dampening the silk of her gown. Alina did not move to find shelter. She stood perfectly still, watching the doors of the church behind her, waiting to see if anyone would come after her. No one did. She lifted her chin, wiped the rain from her cheek with the back of her hand, and began walking toward home, alone, leaving behind the life she had built and the sister who had taken it from her without a single word of apology. The house felt different when Alina returned to it, as though the walls themselves had already heard the news and turned cold toward her. Servants who once greeted her warmly now lowered their eyes when she passed. Her mother stayed in her room for 2 days, claiming a headache, though Alina suspected it was something closer to embarrassment. Alina moved into the east wing, a part of the house rarely used, quiet and far from the main rooms where Camille now received visitors nearly every afternoon. Flowers arrived for Camille almost daily, sent by families eager to congratulate her on securing Julian Cross, a man with land and a respected name. No flowers arrived for Alina. No letters either, except one, brief and formal, from an aunt who seemed to think a wedding gift could still be salvaged by simply changing the name on the card. She discovered this by accident, flipping through a stack of correspondence left carelessly on a hallway table. The gift, a set of silver candlesticks meant for her marriage, was now addressed to Camille and Julian. Alina stared at the new label for a long moment, feeling something harden inside her chest. She began paying closer attention to the small things she had ignored before. The way her mother avoided certain topics at dinner. The way her father cleared his throat whenever Julian's name came up. The way Camille always seemed to know details about the wedding day before anyone told her. One evening, Alina found an old letter tucked behind a drawer in the study, written in her father's hand, addressed to Julian's family months before the wedding date had even been announced. The letter spoke of an arrangement, of land boundaries and inherited debts, and near the bottom, a line that made her stomach turn. It mentioned that either daughter would satisfy the terms of the agreement, as long as the marriage secured the family's finances. Alina sat with the letter for a long time, reading it again and again, as if repetition might change its meaning. It did not. She was never meant to marry for anything real. She had simply been the first daughter available, and when a better opportunity presented itself through Camille, the arrangement had shifted without anyone bothering to inform her. She folded the letter and placed it in the small chest where she kept the few things that still felt like hers. Anger settled over her, but it was not loud or wild. It was quiet, steady, the kind of anger that clarifies rather than destroys. She stopped waiting for an apology. She stopped listening at doors to hear if anyone spoke of her with regret. Instead, she began writing to a distant relative in the city, an aunt who had once offered her a place to stay if she ever needed to leave, no questions required. Alina packed a single trunk, taking only what belonged to her before the wedding had ever been planned. She did not tell her parents. She did not tell Camille. She simply intended to build a life somewhere no one would look at her with pity or guilt, somewhere her name meant something other than the woman who had been left standing at the altar. The invitation arrived from a family Alina barely knew, distant acquaintances of her aunt who were hosting a small gathering to mark the christening of their newest child. Alina almost declined, unwilling to face another room full of familiar faces, but her aunt insisted she attend, saying it would do her good to be seen somewhere other than her own house. The gathering was smaller than most events Alina had attended before, quiet conversation filling a bright drawing room instead of the noisy chatter she was used to at larger parties. She stood near a window, holding a cup of tea she had no real interest in drinking, when a tall man in dark gray approached the same window, seemingly searching for a quiet corner of his own. He introduced himself simply as Nathaniel, without any of the practiced flourish men usually added when mentioning their title. Alina later learned from a passing whisper that he was the Duke of Camden, a man known for avoiding social events unless business required his presence. Their conversation began plainly enough, comments about the weather and the crowded room, but Alina noticed something different in the way he spoke to her. He did not ask about her wedding. He did not offer sympathy dressed up as curiosity. He simply spoke to her as though she were a person standing in front of him, nothing more complicated than that. She found herself relaxing, if only slightly, answering his questions honestly instead of offering the careful, polished responses she gave everyone else. When he asked what she thought of the city, she admitted she barely knew it yet, having only just begun to consider leaving her family home behind. He did not press further, though something in his expression suggested he understood there was more to the story than she was willing to share. Across the room, Camille noticed the exchange and made her way toward them, smiling brightly, clearly recognizing the value of a duke's attention. She introduced herself with practiced charm, mentioning her recent engagement to Julian Cross as though it were relevant information Nathaniel needed immediately. Nathaniel listened politely, offered brief congratulations, and then, without any obvious effort, returned his attention to Alina, asking her opinion on something entirely unrelated to weddings or engagements. Camille's smile faltered for just a moment before she recovered, clearly unused to being redirected so easily. Alina caught the slight shift in her sister's expression and felt a small, private satisfaction she immediately tried to suppress, unwilling to build anything on the discomfort of another person, even Camille. Before the evening ended, Nathaniel mentioned he hoped to see her again, phrased simply enough that it could have meant nothing at all. Alina thanked him politely and left the gathering without expecting anything further to come from it. Walking home in the cool evening air, she found herself thinking about the conversation longer than she intended to, turning over his words the way one turns over a stone to see what lies underneath. Word traveled quickly through the small circles of society that the Duke of Camden had been asking after Alina, quietly inquiring which family she belonged to and where she now resided. Camille heard the rumor within a matter of days and immediately set her plan into motion, certain that whatever attention Alina had received could easily be redirected toward herself. Camille arranged to attend every gathering she believed Nathaniel might visit, dressing carefully, rehearsing conversation topics she thought a duke might find impressive. At one such event, she approached him directly, speaking at length about her engagement, her family's connections, and her plans for a grand wedding in the spring. Nathaniel listened with polite patience, but his responses remained brief, and his eyes moved toward the door more than once, as though searching for someone else entirely. When Camille asked if he might call on her family sometime soon, he offered a courteous but firm answer, explaining that his schedule left little room for new acquaintances at present. Camille understood the rejection for exactly what it was, though she chose not to acknowledge it aloud, retreating instead with a tight smile and an excuse about needing to greet other guests. 2 weeks later, Nathaniel appeared at a family gathering hosted by Alina's aunt, arriving without prior announcement, which caused a ripple of surprised conversation among the guests. He approached Alina directly, in full view of her parents and Camille, asking if she might walk with him through the garden for a few moments. Alina agreed, aware of every eye in the room following them as they stepped outside. The garden was quiet, lit only by scattered lanterns, and Nathaniel spoke plainly, telling her he had thought of their earlier conversation often and hoped she would allow him to call on her properly, without any confusion about his intentions. Alina studied his face for any sign of performance, any hint that his interest was rooted in pity for her public humiliation rather than genuine regard. She found none. His expression remained steady, direct, entirely without the practiced charm Camille so often relied upon. When they returned inside, Camille's expression had shifted from polite interest to something colder, though she said nothing outright. Alina's mother, meanwhile, seemed suddenly eager to speak with her, offering compliments she had withheld for weeks. In the following days, news arrived that Julian's finances were not as secure as the family had believed when arranging the earlier marriage agreement. Debts once hidden began surfacing, and whispers suggested his interest in the family had always been tied more to convenience than affection. Camille found herself defending a match that no longer offered the security she had assumed it would provide. Alina, watching from a distance, felt no satisfaction in her sister's growing troubles, only a quiet confirmation of what she had already suspected. The arrangement had never been about love, not for Julian, and perhaps not truly for Camille either. Nathaniel called on Alina regularly over the following weeks, always with a clear purpose in mind, never with vague promises he had no intention of keeping. He asked her opinions on matters most men dismissed as unimportant for a woman to consider, listening carefully to her answers instead of simply waiting for his turn to speak. Alina, in turn, refused to let herself be swept quickly into anything resembling the life she had once imagined with Julian. She asked Nathaniel direct questions about his expectations, his family, and his reasons for pursuing her attention when so many others would have welcomed his interest without hesitation. He answered each question honestly, without frustration, understanding that her caution had been earned through experience rather than simple shyness. Meanwhile, Camille's engagement to Julian grew increasingly strained. His financial troubles became common knowledge, and several families who had once admired the match now spoke of it with quiet reservation. Camille, unwilling to abandon the security she believed the marriage still offered, pressed forward with wedding preparations, though the excitement she once displayed had noticeably dimmed. One afternoon, Alina's mother approached her with an unfamiliar softness, admitting that the family had made a serious error in how they handled the arrangement between her and Julian. It was not a full apology, but it was closer to acknowledgement than Alina had expected to receive. Alina listened politely, thanked her mother for the honesty, but made no promises about forgetting what had happened. She had learned over the past months that dignity did not require loud confrontation. It required simply refusing to shrink herself for the comfort of others, refusing to pretend the humiliation had not happened, and refusing to let bitterness decide her future for her. When Nathaniel eventually asked for her hand, he did so privately, without an audience to witness the moment, without any need to prove his intentions to anyone but her. Alina accepted, not because she needed rescuing, but because she had come to trust the steady, honest way he treated her, entirely unlike the arrangement she had narrowly escaped. Their wedding, when it came, was modest by comparison to grand society standards, attended by people who genuinely wished them well rather than those simply performing obligation. Camille and Julian were invited, a gesture of grace rather than triumph, and both attended briefly before leaving early, their own engagement now quietly dissolved under the weight of unresolved debts and diminished trust. Months later, at a large gathering hosted by mutual acquaintances, Alina found herself standing near the same kind of window where she had first met Nathaniel. Camille entered the room across from her, no longer engaged, her earlier confidence noticeably subdued. Alina did not turn away, nor did she seek out her sister to speak. She simply continued her conversation with Nathaniel, calm and unhurried, no longer watching the door for approval, no longer measuring her worth by comparison to anyone else in the room. For the first time since the day she had walked out of that church alone, Alina felt entirely certain of exactly where she belonged.